We know pitchers tinker, and a lot of the time I think it's their way of telling us something through the data. Some pitchers have earned the right to tinker, others are young and maybe their organization doesn't want them tinkering. Is there a correct approach to take as an organization? And what do adjustments, even in the face of good peripherals, tell us about a pitcher? Take George Kirby, for example. His season so far has been a mix of up and downs. A bad start to the season, a string of good starts, and then some yo-yoing recently. On one hand, if you're George Kirby, you can look at your line and go, I'm getting unlucky. My FIP is lower than my ERA, nothing looks out of line compared to last year, this will all wash out and things will be fine. But that's not what Kirby is doing. Instead, he's tinkering. Take his 4 most recent starts beginning on May 8th. He's done 4 things that jump out to me compared to his prior 7 outings. He's added a cutter, he's cut back heavily on his four-seam fastball usage to right-handed hitters, he started throwing more sinker to both right and left-handed hitters, and the sinkers he's throwing to right-handed hitters have been more middle in to down in on the inner third of the plate as opposed to more up in the zone. The cutter is probably his most interesting addition. The pitch lines up with a pretty standard cutter from a shape perspective. It's 1 mile per hour harder than the average cutter. Stuff models see it as around an average pitch, which I think I'd agree with. Most of his pitches play up with command anyways. He's throwing it under 8% of the time to righties, so it's not dominating his usage, but that handedness seems to be his focus. So why is he throwing it? I think he's trying to make his breaking balls to right-handed hitters better. Although we're looking at a small sample of balls in play, the expected damage on his slider this year compared to last year has shot up. The swinging strike rate is slightly down, he's not generating as much chase on it, and the swing rate is down as well. It's just not been an effective pitch. So even if the cutter doesn't grade out as his best pitch, and he's still trying to find his feel for it, as you can see, and you could argue he should just be throwing his better pitches more, the cutter might serve as a way to get his breaking ball performance to right-handed hitters back. Throw something hard, away from righties, to throw them off that slower breaker that are also primarily away from that handedness. And if the cutter plays its part in that successful rejuvenation, then it served its purpose, regardless of what Stuff Plus says. The other 3 tweaks he has made are interesting. His four-seam to righties was actually successful despite some of the swing and miss on it lagging relative to last year. Regardless, it seems like he just didn't want to throw that pitch as much, either ahead or behind in the count, and instead what he started to do is throw more sinker. Kirby's usage has jumped 10 percentage points to both lefties and righties. The pitch doesn't miss almost any bats, but it's done a good job of limiting hard contact, and a lot of the contact it does allow is on the ground. While the cutter tweak makes some sense to me, this sinker one kind of doesn't, particularly because I thought the point of the cutter was to revive swing miss on his breakers, but his four-seam is his better swing and miss fastball. So it's almost like he's trying to seek out more contact and record quicker outs perhaps, which I get philosophically if he just doesn't think his old mix is going to work. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate the approach because the pitch is still good and his command is still really sharp. It's just not really what I expected. Adding the cutter and keeping everything else intact is maybe more what I thought he would do. But maybe there's some galaxy brain plan in here that I'm overlooking. He is George Kirby at the end of the day. So what does this tinkering tell us about George Kirby? I think it's a combination of 2 things. The first being that his knee might just be bothering him. This is not a fun answer at all, but I had to bring it up because it's been mentioned in some reporting that he's dealing with knee soreness. I don't know how perhaps that's affecting him. Again, we don't see a massive difference in much of his peripherals. It's not really affecting his command from some of the advanced command stats we have. So I just wanted to lay this one out there and consider it as a possibility, even if it's a minor one. Number 2 is far more interesting. It has to do with the idea that I understand positive regression is down the road for me, but I'm not really willing to wait for that to happen, and therefore I want to take a more active role in tinkering to try to get to that regression faster, so to speak, or change who I am as a pitcher to then counteract whatever hitters are doing against me that maybe I see as an issue. Now, I think a lot of pitchers are just fine with the process generally, or buying into the process and assuming that they will get better by doing the exact same thing. But then there's this faction, I think, of pitchers, you could call them tinkerers, so to speak, like a George Kirby, who wants to take a more active role in things and therefore, takes the four-seam fastball. That's a really good pitch against righties, has generated a lot of swing and miss, wasn't underperforming, and he lowers the usage on it and brings up the sinker usage. And then perhaps he adds the cutter, which is maybe a little more logical to help out the breaking balls on the outer third. The idea here being that Kirby's taking a more active role in things, despite what the underlying stats might say, and despite him probably being a process-driven pitcher, he's more interested in trying to actively tweak to get to better results. And that, I think, is something that maybe isn't totally backed up by the data that the Mariners organization has. Perhaps it's not what they would recommend fully. But regardless, it is something that Kirby wants to do and therefore is doing, as we can see. But the other pitcher we can talk about right now maybe has a more obvious case to need tinkering. Hunter Brown had a 9.78 ERA, a 5.72 FIP, and a 4.23 xFIP through his first 6 starts of the season, which is just a wildly frustrating line. Terrible results, bad peripherals, and 1 ERA predictor going. There's no way you're going to continue giving up this number of home runs. So Brown went, I'm tired of this, let's reinvent. He started throwing a new sinker to right-handed hitters. He ditched the new hard cutter he started throwing in the offseason to righties. He moved 6 or 7 inches towards the third base side of the rubber. And to lefties, he started throwing his new bullet slider again. The rubber shift is a fun one. I always feel like this is the, oh crap, we need to do something bold and do it quick adjustment. It's one of those things that's easy to communicate from a media standpoint. So we cite it often when it works, but we rarely talk about it when it doesn't work, or we don't notice it because there's no change in performance. I wonder whether it's used mainly as a tool to just change the visual for a pitcher and kind of reset their mainframe, so to speak, and I see some value in that. And on top of the rubber move, he also did a George Kirby, where he adjusted a pitch that was kind of doing well. He added a hard cutter to righties in the offseason. It had a 36% swing miss rate, which is awesome for a cutter, and it wasn't really allowing a ton of damage. But he nixed it in favor of this new sinker of his, which is more like a two-seam fastball, given he's a pretty over-the-top pitcher, so the pitch has more run than drop. The sinker I don't mind because now he's throwing something hard and inside to right-handed hitters. His righty four-seam had the largest difference between results and expected results in his mix. In short, he was getting unlucky with it, so I maybe get pulling some of the usage down on it to mix in another fastball to maybe help out that four-seam fastball on the outer third of the plate. I don't think necessarily this was a bad tweak, so to speak. But wait, he moved the location of his four-seam fastball as well. Now it's down and into righties where it used to be up away. That's kind of an odder tweak to me. It's sitting in the same spot of the zone as his new sinker, which feels slightly unintentional given that his four-seam generally performs best up in the zone. Regardless of what I think, if you faced him as a righty in April and then again in May, your scouting report is very different. And like Kirby, there's some obvious changes here mixed in with others that I think I'm still trying to snuff out the reasoning for. To lefties, Brown's changes were less drastic. He started throwing his new bullet slider, which doesn't seem to be missing bats, but it has been good overall. His four-seam was getting tagged pretty hard, so he moved that to the outer third of the plate. While he kind of has nothing to go inside now to lefties, his process may just to be getting to his splitter any way possible, which is a really good pitch, with more of a blank palette in terms of how he will get to that splitter. And what has the result been in all of this? Better, but still not totally amazing. His ERA has come down a lot. FIP still likes him a bit better as well, and the xFIP is still suggesting that he will do a better job of limiting home runs. So we'll see how things progress, but I do think these changes were positive overall. In the case of George Kirby, we learned that even in the face of underlying peripherals that suggest positive regression is coming, there's still a faction of pitchers who've perhaps earned the right to tinker their way such that the regression happens quicker, or at least they get back to success as quickly as possible. And in Hunter Brown's case, it's a different story. He's a pitcher that probably hasn't pitched long enough to earn the right to do that tinkering. So the onus goes back in the organization to be more aggressive in making usage tweaks and adding new pitches to help that pitcher progress and improve very quickly. Now, probably there's some roster implication stuff here in terms of 40-man and options, etc., that could have had influence on the Astros doing this at the major league level with Hunter Brown. But the reality is they made these tweaks very quickly. I would argue some of them were pretty aggressive, and the results so far have been pretty positive. I think I definitely land on the side of being more accepting of risk in terms of trying to make pitchers better, whether it be from a usage perspective or an adding new pitches perspective. But I also understand that I do not have skin in the game, so this is something that's probably easy for me to theorize on because I'm not the one that will be affected by whatever downside risk you could run into in these situations. But I understand that because in an organization, your changes are probably much more marginal and you're incentivized to keep your job and not have organizational turnover. And I would argue the best way to do that, for most organizations at least, is probably not to take on any kind of outsized risk that could potentially have a ton of reward. Now, the best organizations, I think, balance this better and also understand that a couple failures are fine in individual instances as long as you have an eventual payoff that has really good tail outcome and produces a bunch of results for your organization. But anyways, that's me rambling. I hope in this video you learned a pair of things. One, underlying peripherals are really important, but on a player level, I do think these guys that can tinker and are willing to tinker want to get to that positive regression quicker, and therefore will make changes, even if the underlying stats say if you do absolutely nothing different, we expect you to be a better pitcher. And then the second angle is what I just talked about from an organizational level, them being more aggressive, tinkering with pitchers. But I'm interested in your thoughts as to whether you agree with that, as to whether you're maybe more risk averse. And as always, I'll be in the comments to hear any thoughts, have a discussion, and thank you for watching.